It was a calm evening just outside the city, the kind of night where the streets were mostly empty and the air felt cool after a long day of sunlight. The sound of tires on asphalt echoed faintly, and the glow of streetlights stretched over the road like a golden ribbon. Inside a dark gray sedan, a woman in her early 50s drove quietly, her mind still turning over the events of her long day. She was the head of the FBI, though anyone passing her on the road would never guess it. She looked like any other person heading home after work, her jacket neatly folded on the seat beside her, her face tired but calm, her thoughts far away. Her name was Elaine Carter. She had spent the day buried in meetings, signing off on reports and talking to agents about a new joint operation. It had been one of those endless Fridays where the minutes crawl by until the sun finally begins to sink. When she finally stepped out of the office that evening, she felt the relief of being free from the tension of leadership, even if only for a few hours. Elaine didn't use her government car that day. She preferred to drive herself sometimes to feel normal again. No motorcade, no security escort, just her and the open road. She was heading home to her quiet neighborhood about 30 minutes away, thinking about the weekend she had promised to spend with her sister and her niece. Her phone sat face down on the passenger seat, silent for once. The radio played softly, an old jazz tune that reminded her of her father. The night seemed peaceful, steady, and predictable. She smiled to herself, finally allowing her mind to drift away from the never-ending list of responsibilities waiting on her desk. Then she saw it, bright red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror, her brow furrowed. For a split second, she thought maybe the officer wanted to pass her, but when the light stayed fixed behind her and a short burst of the siren wailed, she realized the patrol car was pulling her over. Elaine looked down at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her license and registration were in perfect order. She hadn't even changed lanes in miles. Confused, she slowed down and signaled to pull over to the side of the road. The shoulder was wide, quiet, lit only by a few distant lamps. She shifted into park, took a deep breath, and waited. Her instincts, sharpened by decades in law enforcement, told her to stay calm and follow procedure. She knew how traffic stops could spiral out of control. She had reviewed hundreds of body cam videos over the years. Her hand moved slowly to retrieve her ID from her purse, but she paused, not wanting to make sudden movements before the officer reached the window. The police cruiser rolled up behind her, headlights cutting through her rear window. She could see the shape of the officer stepping out, his silhouette tall and rigid. She glanced in her side mirror. His hand was already resting on his holster. That was unusual. He approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting across her car. She rolled down her window halfway and placed both hands on the steering wheel, visible. "Good evening, officer," she said in a calm voice. "Is there a problem?" The officer didn't respond immediately. The flashlight shone directly into her eyes, forcing her to squint. "License and registration," he said sharply. His tone carried no warmth, only suspicion. Elaine nodded slowly. "Of course. My wallet's on the seat beside me. May I reach for it?" He hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. She moved carefully, keeping her movements deliberate and slow. Just as she'd trained countless agents to do in tense encounters, she handed him her license and registration, along with her federal identification card, which clearly showed her position in the FBI. The officer took them but didn't even glance at the federal badge. His expression was stern, almost annoyed. "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car reported earlier tonight," he said. Elaine blinked. "That's impossible," she replied gently. "This is my personal car. You can run the plates if you'd like. I'll decide what to check," he snapped, stepping back slightly. "Stay in the vehicle." Something about his tone set off a quiet alarm in her mind. It wasn't just authority it was hostility. She could sense his nerves, his suspicion, maybe even anger, though she didn't know why. He walked back to his cruiser, but instead of checking her information right away, he spoke into his radio. She couldn't make out the words, but she saw him glance repeatedly at her car. Her instincts told her that something was off. She took a deep breath and reminded herself to remain calm. She'd been in worse situations before, dangerous field operations, high-risk arrests, but this felt different. There was no crime scene, no mission, no criminal in sight. Just her sitting in her car, being treated like a suspect. After a minute or two, he returned, this time with his hand fully on his weapon. Elaine felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "Officer, I'd prefer to know why before I do that," she said evenly. "I've identified myself. You have my credentials." "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated louder now. Elaine didn't want this to escalate. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible. Her training told her to de-escalate, to keep her voice steady and movements predictable. "I'm a federal officer," she said clearly. "Please look at the identification I gave you." "You'll see." "Quiet," he barked, cutting her off. "Hands where I can see them." Her heart sank. It wasn't fear, it was disbelief. She could hardly process what was happening. She had spent decades enforcing the law, teaching others how to act responsibly in the field. Now, standing under the flashing lights, she was on the receiving end of a power she had always respected. She raised her hands slowly, palms open, standing still beside her car. "Officer," she said softly, "you're making a mistake. I'm not who you think I am." But the officer didn't seem to hear her. His breathing was heavy, his eyes wide, and his stance tense. It was the kind of body language she recognized instantly: adrenaline, fear, and an assumption of danger. Elaine could see his hand trembling slightly on the grip of his weapon. She didn't move. Every second felt longer than the one before it. In her mind, she thought of the hundreds of men and women she had trained to handle situations like this with care. She had told them countless times, respect is the first rule of authority. But in that moment, she felt none of it coming from the man in front of her. Another minute passed. The road was empty. No witnesses, just the sound of distant traffic, the hum of the patrol car's engine, and the tension between them, thick enough to feel in the air. Finally, she spoke again, her voice firm but calm. "Officer, please call your supervisor. This situation can be cleared up immediately." He hesitated, then lifted his radio. His voice was low and clipped, calling for backup. Elaine stood perfectly still, every muscle locked in quiet control. She thought of how easily things could go wrong, not just for her, but for anyone caught in a misunderstanding like this. She thought about the fear that drove people to overreact, the bias that turned simple moments into tragedy. It wasn't anger she felt. It was sadness, a quiet ache for how broken trust could become, even between people who wore the same badge. Minutes later, another patrol car appeared down the road. Its headlights drew closer, then stopped behind the first cruiser. Two more officers stepped out. One of them looked younger, more cautious. He approached from the passenger side, scanning the scene carefully. Elaine could see his expression change when his flashlight caught the glint of her badge on the seat. His eyes widened slightly, realizing what he was seeing. The first officer still hadn't noticed. He was focused entirely on her, his jaw tight, his body stiff. The younger officer said something quietly to him, a few words Elaine couldn't catch. The first officer snapped something back, shaking his head. The younger man frowned and moved closer to the car, shining the light directly onto her credentials. That was when everything shifted. He turned sharply toward his partner, urgency in his tone now. Elaine could see the confusion spreading across the first officer's face. For a brief second, he glanced at her, then at the ID again, as if realizing too late who he had been shouting at. But before anyone could explain or calm the situation, the sound of distant sirens filled the night. Elaine's phone, still on the passenger seat, had automatically sent a silent distress signal to the bureau when her ID scanner detected the stop and a potential alert from her wearable device. Within moments, her field agents would arrive, and the quiet roadside would no longer be quiet at all. Elaine stood still, her hands still raised, her heart steady now. She knew this wasn't over, not even close. What she didn't know was that this single, tense encounter would soon become a national story, replayed on every news channel in the country. But for now, under the cold beam of police lights, it was just one officer, one mistake, and one woman who knew that truth would eventually catch up, even if it took a moment of fear to bring it to light. The wail of approaching sirens broke the heavy silence on the side of the road. The sound grew louder every second, echoing between the quiet trees and the open stretch of highway. Blue and red lights flickered in the distance, bouncing off the surface of Elaine's car. She stood completely still, her hands still visible, watching the scene unfold with steady eyes. Her years in law enforcement had trained her to keep calm in chaos, but deep inside she couldn't ignore the sting of disbelief. She had worked her entire life to build trust between federal and local police, to show that justice should come before pride, and now, here she was, standing under flashing lights, being treated like a threat instead of a leader. The first patrol officer still had his hand near his holster, though his grip had loosened slightly. He looked uncertain now, caught between confusion and fear of being wrong. The younger officer beside him kept glancing between Elaine's car and his superior, as if unsure what to do. The second wave of patrol cars pulled up, stopping hard behind the first. Several officers stepped out quickly, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. One of them, a middle-aged sergeant with calm eyes, approached the scene with measured steps. His voice carried quiet authority. "What's going on here?" he asked firmly. The first officer straightened, trying to sound in control. "Possible stolen vehicle, sir. Suspect refused to comply at first." Elaine took a slow breath, her voice steady but edged with exhaustion. "I identified myself clearly multiple times. My credentials are on the seat. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The sergeant turned his light toward her face, studying her for a moment. Then he looked through the open car window and saw the ID, the photo, the seal, the unmistakable credentials of someone no patrol officer wanted to mishandle. He blinked once, the reality hitting him instantly. His voice softened. "Ma'am, I see it now. Please, you can lower your hands." Elaine did so slowly, her composure never breaking. The tension in her shoulders eased, though her heart still beat fast from the shock of the last few minutes. The sergeant turned toward the first officer. "Did you check the ID before escalating?" The officer hesitated, his jaw tight. I was following procedure. The situation seemed suspicious." The sergeant's tone sharpened, though he kept it low. "Suspicious. She handed you government identification and you ignored it." The younger officer stepped forward quietly. "Sir, I tried to tell him—" The sergeant held up a hand, stopping him. "I'll handle it." Elaine watched them, saying nothing. Her instincts told her that silence was more powerful than words right now. The sergeant turned back toward her. "Director Carter, I'm very sorry for this misunderstanding. Please understand this isn't how our department operates." Elaine gave a small nod. "I appreciate that, Sergeant. I just want to make sure this situation is handled properly." He nodded back, clearly embarrassed. "Of course. If you'd like, we can escort you home." But she shook her head. "That won't be necessary." At that moment, 2 unmarked black SUVs arrived, the kind that belonged to federal agents. The headlights dimmed and several agents stepped out quickly. They didn't shout or rush. They moved with quiet precision, their presence alone shifting the entire mood. One of them approached Elaine. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said quietly. "Just an unfortunate misunderstanding." The agent nodded and stood beside her, his expression unreadable. The local officers stepped back, realizing the weight of what they'd stumbled into. The first officer, the one who had drawn his weapon, avoided everyone's eyes. The tension that once filled his body now turned into something else, dread. The sergeant motioned him aside. Their voices were low, but the quiet of the night made bits of the conversation drift through the air. "You didn't verify her ID? You drew your weapon on the FBI director." "I didn't know." The situation was tense. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Elaine didn't listen further. She walked slowly toward her car, her agents close by. One of them opened the door for her, but she paused, resting her hand on the roof of the car. Her eyes wandered over the flashing lights, the faces of the officers, the nervous movements, the quiet shame that had settled over the group. She had seen hundreds of incidents like this from afar. Ordinary citizens caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, misunderstood, treated like criminals before the facts were known. But now, standing on the other side of it, she understood the helplessness that those people must have felt. The waiting, the confusion, the disbelief. The sergeant approached again, his voice soft now. "Director Carter, again on behalf of our department, I deeply apologize. I'll be filing an incident report tonight. You have every right to request an internal review." Elaine met his gaze. "You won't need to worry about that. The Bureau will handle it." He nodded, knowing exactly what that meant. She got back into her car, closing the door gently. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring through the windshield at the flashing lights. The reflection of red and blue flickered across her face. Her hands rested still on the steering wheel, but her mind raced. Her radio buzzed quietly. The voice of one of her deputies came through the line. "Director, we received your alert. Are you secure?" "Yes," she said softly. "Situation is contained. Do you want us to file immediate complaint protocol?" She paused. "Not yet. I'll speak with the chief of police first. Then we'll proceed." When the SUVs pulled away, following her car for a short distance to ensure her safety, the local officers were left behind in uneasy silence. The sergeant turned toward his team. "Everyone, pack it up. Leave the scene as it is. Report to headquarters immediately after." The younger officer lingered near his car, his eyes following the taillights of Elaine's vehicle as they disappeared down the dark road. He shook his head slowly, clearly unsettled. The first officer leaned against his cruiser, staring at the ground. His face had lost all color. He mumbled something under his breath. No one could hear it clearly. The sergeant's voice was low but sharp. "You better start writing your statement tonight." Back in her car, Elaine drove in silence. The jazz music that had been playing earlier was still on, but the tune felt different now, distant, hollow. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly as she replayed the events in her head. She wasn't angry at the officer, at least not entirely. She was frustrated at the system that had allowed such fear and mistrust to grow. A simple misunderstanding had turned into a dangerous encounter because one man saw threat before truth. When she reached home, the quiet of her driveway felt surreal. The porch light glowed softly, and her neighbor's dog barked once somewhere in the distance. It should have been a normal night, but it wasn't. She sat in the car for a moment before turning off the engine. Her reflection in the rearview mirror looked tired, almost older. Inside her home, she dropped her keys on the counter and took off her coat. The silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. She made a cup of tea, hoping it would calm her thoughts. But her mind wouldn't slow down. She opened her laptop at the kitchen table and began typing notes, every detail she could remember: the time of the stop, the officer's badge number, his tone, the sequence of events. Not out of revenge, but out of duty. This would be documented properly, the same way every other case was. Her phone buzzed again. It was her deputy. "Director, the incident's already being reviewed by media monitoring. The story might leak. I figured it might," she said quietly. "Let it come out. But we'll tell it truthfully when the time's right." She hung up and stared at the steam rising from her cup. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to feel, not just as a leader, but as a person. The shock, the helplessness, the realization that even authority didn't always protect someone from misjudgment. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful again, unaware of what had almost happened just a few miles away. Elaine stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark, quiet street. Somewhere out there, the officer was probably writing his report, replaying the same moments with regret. She didn't hate him, but she knew there had to be consequences, not just for him, but for the system that had let such fear guide judgment. As the night grew darker, Elaine closed her laptop, turned off the light, and sat quietly in the dark for a while. The road that had once felt so ordinary now carried a weight she couldn't forget. What she didn't realize yet was that the body camera footage of the entire stop had already been uploaded to the department's internal system, and within hours, it would reach far beyond it. By morning, the world would know exactly what had happened on that quiet road, and nothing about her life, or the officers, would ever be the same again. The sun rose quietly the next morning, spreading a soft light across the city. Inside her house, Elaine sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, her eyes fixed on the phone beside her. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flashing lights again, the officer's trembling hand, and the disbelief that filled her chest when he refused to listen. Her phone finally buzzed. The caller ID showed a familiar number, the Bureau's Public Affairs Office. She took a deep breath and answered. "Director, good morning," the voice said. "We've got a situation." Elaine didn't ask what kind. She already knew. "The footage is out, isn't it?" she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. It started circulating late last night. Someone in the local department leaked the body cam video. News outlets picked it up around 5 a.m. It's everywhere now." Elaine pressed her fingers to her temple. "How bad is it?" "It's trending nationwide. Every major network is running it. Some are saying you were racially profiled. Others are focusing on police misconduct. Everyone has their own angle. Elaine sighed softly. All right, set up a briefing in 1 hour. I want to talk to the legal team and internal affairs before we make any statements. She ended the call and looked out the window. The street outside looked peaceful, almost unaware of the storm brewing in the media world. Birds chirped in the distance. A jogger passed by, waving politely, not realizing the person inside that quiet home was the center of a national story. Elaine took another sip of coffee, her hand trembling slightly. She wasn't afraid of publicity. She had been in front of cameras hundreds of times before. But this was different. This wasn't about a case or a speech. This was personal. By the time she arrived at headquarters, the lobby was filled with tension. Agents whispered to each other, pretending to stay busy but unable to ignore the situation. Every screen in the building was showing the same thing, the body cam footage of the traffic stop. Elaine didn't stop to watch it. She already knew what it showed. The flashing lights, the raised voice, the moment she identified herself and was ignored. And finally, the realization spreading across the officer's face when backup arrived. In the conference room, several senior officials were already waiting. The atmosphere was heavy, serious. A large monitor showed live news coverage. Every headline carried her name. She sat down at the head of the table. All right, she said calmly. Tell me everything. One of her deputies, a man she trusted deeply, leaned forward. The public reaction is huge. Most people are shocked. Some are angry. The officer's department is being bombarded with calls and messages demanding his suspension. Another official added, the local police chief reached out an hour ago. He wants to apologize personally. He also confirmed that the officer has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Elaine nodded. Good. That's the right first step. Her communications director cleared her throat. We need to decide how we handle this publicly. Reporters are outside already. If we don't speak soon, the narrative will spiral. Elaine looked around the room, her expression steady. Then we'll tell the truth. No drama, no finger-pointing, just facts. There was a short silence before she continued. This isn't about me. It's about accountability. If it can happen to someone like me, it can happen to anyone. That's the message I want out there. Calm, respectful, and honest. Everyone nodded, relieved by her composure. A few hours later, Elaine stood behind a podium in the press briefing room. Cameras flashed, microphones lined the table, and reporters filled every seat. The room buzzed with energy and curiosity. She adjusted the microphone slightly and began to speak in a clear, even tone. Last night, I was pulled over by a local police officer. The encounter was tense and unnecessary, but I am safe. I want to make it clear, this is not a story about me. This is a story about how we, as law enforcement professionals, must hold ourselves to the highest standard of conduct. The officer involved will go through due process as is right and fair. I have no anger toward him, but I do believe this incident should remind us that authority must always be guided by restraint and respect. Her words were calm but firm. The room was silent except for the clicking of camera shutters. I want the public to know, she continued, that the FBI will work closely with the local department to review this incident thoroughly. Transparency is not a choice, it's a duty. When she finished, she stepped away from the podium. The reporters shouted questions, but she didn't respond. She wasn't there to debate. She had said what she needed to say. Back in her office, she finally sat down and exhaled deeply. The adrenaline from the morning began to fade, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. Her assistant placed a folder on her desk. It contained the preliminary internal report. She opened it slowly. The officer's name stared back at her in bold letters. There it was, his full record. Dozens of traffic stops, several complaints for aggressive conduct, and notes from supervisors about his temper. Nothing serious enough to remove him, but enough to paint a troubling picture. Elaine closed the file for a moment, leaning back in her chair. She didn't feel triumph or revenge, only disappointment. An hour later, her deputy walked in. Director, the Justice Department wants to coordinate an independent review. They're sending a team over this week. Good, she said softly. Let them handle it thoroughly. As the days passed, the story only grew. Talk shows discussed it every night. Social media filled with debates, some defending the officer, others demanding systemic change. People who had never cared about police reform were suddenly paying attention. Elaine tried to stay focused on her work, but everywhere she went, the stares followed. Some were sympathetic, others were curious, a few were skeptical, questioning whether she was using the situation to make a statement. She ignored the noise. Meanwhile, in the small-town police station where the officer worked, things were falling apart. The chief had called an emergency meeting. The department was flooded with calls, reporters camped outside, and morale among the officers was at an all-time low. Inside a small office, the officer who had pulled over Elaine sat with his hands clasped tightly, staring at the floor. His badge lay on the desk in front of him. The chief stood nearby, reading from a document. "You've been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation," the chief said slowly. "The Department of Justice and Internal Affairs are both involved. You're to surrender your weapon and badge immediately." The officer didn't respond. His face was pale, eyes hollow. He nodded once, wordlessly, and pushed the badge toward his superior. Outside, a crowd of reporters shouted questions as he left the building. He kept his head down, walking past the cameras without a word. Back at FBI headquarters, Elaine received the update quietly. She didn't celebrate it, didn't even comment. Instead, she turned her attention to something more meaningful, finding a way to prevent this kind of incident from happening again. She called for a special meeting with senior law enforcement leaders from across the state. The agenda was simple: mandatory retraining for all officers in identifying law enforcement credentials, escalation communication, and cross-agency respect. At the meeting, she spoke with calm authority. "No amount of training can replace empathy," she said. "We wear badges to protect, not to intimidate. Every encounter we have with the public is an opportunity to build or destroy trust. We can do better. We must do better." The room was quiet. Many of the officers nodded, some embarrassed, others inspired. By the end of that week, several departments agreed to implement joint training sessions with federal officers, a first in the region. The media began calling it the Carter Reform, though Elaine never used that term herself. Late one night after a long day of meetings, she drove home again. The same route as before. The same quiet road. The same stretch where it had all happened. For a moment, she slowed down and looked at the spot where the flashing lights had once filled the darkness. The memory still lived there, sharp, heavy, unforgettable. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer saw it only as a painful moment. She saw it as a turning point, one that might actually lead to change. As she drove away, the road seemed peaceful again. The stars above glowed softly, and the hum of the tires felt comforting this time. Her phone buzzed with a message from her deputy. It was short but meaningful. "DOJ confirms an officer in custody. Formal charges filed." Elaine didn't reply right away. She kept driving, eyes on the open road, her mind quiet. Justice would take its course, but what mattered most to her was what came next. Rebuilding trust, one step at a time. She finally whispered to herself, "We can't change what happened, but we can make sure it never happens again." And as the city lights appeared in the distance, she knew this wasn't just her story anymore. It had become something larger, a story about fear, courage, and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. A story that began with one mistake, but could end with something better: understanding. The city moved quickly in the days that followed. The story of what had happened to the FBI director was no longer just news. It had become a national conversation. Every channel ran segments about it, every podcast debated it, and every newspaper printed headlines that asked the same question: how could something like this happen? Elaine tried to keep her days structured, but it wasn't easy. Every time she walked into a meeting, the looks from her colleagues told her that even inside the bureau, people were still processing what had taken place. Some looked at her with respect, others with quiet sympathy. She didn't want either. She just wanted to get back to work. But the investigation wouldn't allow life to return to normal. By the second week after the incident, a full inquiry was underway. The Department of Justice, the State Attorney's Office, and the FBI's Internal Affairs Division had all joined forces to review every minute of the footage and every piece of communication from that night. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about the culture that allowed that kind of behavior to go unchecked. Elaine sat in her office one morning, going over reports when her deputy knocked and entered quietly. They've concluded the preliminary review, he said, holding a folder. Let's hear it, Elaine replied. He sat down across from her and opened the file. They found multiple violations of procedure. The officer ignored clear identification, escalated without cause, and failed to follow de-escalation protocol. The recommendation is criminal charges, unlawful detention, abuse of authority, and falsifying portions of his report. Elaine didn't react immediately. She just stared at the folder for a few seconds, thinking about how something so small, a single decision, a single misjudgment, could destroy a career and change lives. Has he made a statement? She asked finally. His lawyer released a short one this morning, her deputy said. He said he regrets what happened and that it was never his intention to disrespect anyone. He claims he was following instinct. Elaine nodded slowly. Instinct is supposed to protect people, not endanger them. She leaned back in her chair, letting out a quiet sigh. All right. Let the process continue. No interference from us. Justice has to be clean. Outside the FBI building, a crowd had begun to gather. Protesters holding signs, some demanding justice, others asking for reform. Television vans lined the street. It wasn't chaotic, but the tension was visible. The public wasn't just watching. They were waiting for what came next. That afternoon, Elaine met with the Attorney General in a private office downtown. The mood was calm but serious. Elaine, the Attorney General said softly, we're moving forward with charges. The evidence is solid. The body cam footage, the dispatch logs, the witness accounts, and it's all consistent. Elaine nodded. Do it properly. I don't want a rushed case. I want a fair one. The Attorney General smiled faintly. You've always been measured. I respect that. But just know, this will be a landmark case. Not because it happened to you, but because it exposes something much bigger. Elaine gave a small nod, understanding exactly what that meant. Over the next few days, the media focused heavily on the officer's background. Reporters dug into his history, interviewing former colleagues, neighbors, and even his old supervisors. Stories began to surface. Complaints ignored, warnings unheeded. None of them had been serious enough to remove him from duty, but together they painted a troubling pattern. Elaine watched it all from a distance. She didn't celebrate his downfall. In fact, she felt an ache she couldn't easily explain. For her, justice wasn't about punishment. It was about learning. One night, as she sat alone in her living room, she thought about the officer again. What had shaped him? What pressures had he faced? Was it fear, arrogance, or something deeper that had led him to act the way he did? She didn't have the answers, but she knew this. Every mistake was also a lesson, and she intended to make sure the system learned from this one. The following week, the officer was officially charged. The news broke in the early morning hours, spreading like wildfire. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Camera flashes filled the air as he was brought in for processing, wearing plain clothes, his face pale and drawn. Elaine didn't attend the hearing. She stayed at her desk, reading the statement her communications team had prepared for release. It said, "Justice is not about revenge. It is about responsibility. Today's developments mark a step forward, not only for me, but for everyone who believes in accountability and fairness within law enforcement." She approved it with a small nod. The reactions were mixed. Some people praised her for handling the situation with grace. Others accused her of using her position to ensure a harsher outcome. Elaine ignored the noise. She had spent too many years in public service to let opinions shape her sense of truth. That evening she received a letter, handwritten, unmarked. Inside was a short message. I never meant for it to happen this way. I thought I was doing my job. I was wrong. I hope someday you can forgive me. There was no signature, but she knew who it was from. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer. The next few weeks brought new developments. Training reforms were announced across several states. Departments began reviewing body cam policies, retraining officers on how to recognize federal credentials, and reinforcing the importance of calm communication. For the first time in a long time, change didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt real. Elaine found herself speaking at conferences again, not about crime or security, but about respect and reform. Her words carried a different kind of power now, not from authority, but from experience. At one event, a young cadet asked her, "How did you stay calm that night?" "Weren't you angry?" Elaine smiled softly. "Anger doesn't solve anything, calm does. When you stay calm, you control the outcome. When you lose your temper, the moment controls you." The audience nodded quietly, some taking notes. As she stepped off the stage, she thought about how far things had come since that night on the roadside. What had once been a humiliating and frightening experience had become a story that sparked reform, not because of outrage, but because of understanding. Still, she carried the memory with her. Every time she saw flashing lights in her rearview mirror, her chest tightened for a moment before she reminded herself that things were changing. Slowly, but changing. A few months later, she received another message from the Attorney General's office. The trial date had been set. It would be open to the public, and the nation was already preparing to watch. Elaine didn't look forward to it, but she knew she had to attend. Not as a victim, but as a witness to truth. The day of the trial, the courthouse was surrounded by media. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The officer sat quietly beside his lawyer, his face unreadable. When Elaine entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. She walked to her seat with quiet dignity, her head held high. When she took the stand, the questions were simple. She described what happened that night, the stop, the fear, the disbelief. Her voice never wavered. She didn't exaggerate or dramatize. She just told the truth. The officer never looked up, but everyone could feel the weight of her words. By the time she stepped down, the courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed moved. When the verdict finally came weeks later, the headlines were everywhere again. The officer was found guilty of abuse of authority and falsifying official documents. The sentence was not long, but it was enough to send a message. Elaine didn't comment publicly. She stayed quiet, letting the system speak for itself. That night, as she drove home once again along that same stretch of road, she noticed something she hadn't before. A new traffic sign posted near the shoulder. It read, "Train with honor, serve with care." She slowed down and smiled faintly. Maybe someone in the department had put it there as a reminder. Maybe it was coincidence. Either way, it felt right. The sky was a soft shade of gold as the sun set behind the trees. She rolled down her window, letting the wind brush against her face. The world wasn't perfect, not yet. But in that quiet moment, she felt something close to peace. She whispered to herself, "It was worth it." And with that, she pressed her foot gently on the accelerator and drove toward the horizon, leaving behind the place where everything had changed, and moving forward into the world she hoped would now be just a little better than before. The days after the verdict were quiet. The news cycle was still buzzing with commentary, interviews, and endless debates, but for Elaine, everything suddenly felt slower. It was as if time itself had exhaled. The courtroom drama was over. Yet the echoes of what had happened lingered everywhere she went. When she returned to work, the halls of the FBI headquarters seemed a little different. People greeted her softly, respectfully. Some of them paused as she walked past, not out of fear but admiration. It wasn't the kind of attention she wanted, but she understood it. Everyone knew what she had gone through. Everyone had seen how she handled it, calm, steady, professional. On her first morning back, she sat at her desk with a cup of coffee, looking out the window. The sky was pale blue, and the city below was waking up. She felt a quiet sense of gratitude, not because justice had been served, but because something inside her had shifted. Her assistant came in carrying a small box of letters. "These came for you," she said softly. Elaine raised an eyebrow. "All for me?" "Yes, from all over the country. Some even from other countries." She smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'll go through them." After the assistant left, Elaine opened the first few envelopes. Most were handwritten, filled with kind words and stories from people who had faced similar situations, people who had felt powerless, misunderstood, or wronged by authority figures. Some wrote that her calm courage gave them hope. Others simply thanked her for reminding the world that leadership didn't always mean standing tall. Sometimes it meant standing still when the world expected you to shout. One letter caught her attention. It was from a retired police captain in Ohio. It read, "I spent 30 years in uniform and I've seen good and bad officers. What happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone. Your patience that night showed the kind of strength every officer should learn. I hope your story is taught in every academy." Elaine sat quietly after reading it, feeling something warm settle in her chest. Maybe that was what this whole ordeal had been about. Teaching. Not punishment, not revenge, but education. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference in Washington. She hadn't planned to accept any invitations for a while, but this one felt important. She wanted to talk. Not about herself, but about what could change. The auditorium was full that morning. Officers from different states, agency leaders, and cadets filled the seats. The air was expectant. When Elaine stepped on stage, she didn't look like a high-ranking official. She looked like a woman who had lived through something she couldn't forget. She began simply. When I joined law enforcement, I believed in fairness. I believed in the badge, the oath, and the idea that power must always serve the people, never the other way around. That belief hasn't changed, but I've learned that belief alone isn't enough. It needs training. It needs accountability. And it needs empathy. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent. What happened to me could have happened to anyone, she continued. It happened not because of one person's bad decision, but because of years of habits, assumptions, and unchecked behavior. We can't fix the past, but we can build something better for the next generation of officers. The crowd applauded quietly at first, then louder. Many in the audience stood. That night, clips of her speech went viral. People shared her words with captions like "Grace under pressure" and "This is leadership." For the first time, the public seemed united. Not in outrage, but in reflection. Within a few weeks, a new initiative was launched. It was called Project Clarity. The goal was simple: to improve understanding between federal and local law enforcement agencies. Joint training programs were introduced, communication protocols were updated, and simulations were created to teach officers how to recognize legitimate credentials, handle high-stress situations calmly, and verify information before taking drastic action. Elaine wasn't just a figurehead. She was deeply involved. She attended sessions, met recruits, and spoke openly about the night that changed her life. She never dramatized it. She simply told it as it was, and that honesty had more power than any speech. During one of these sessions, a young officer approached her after class. His voice trembled a bit when he said, "Ma'am, I used to think showing authority meant raising my voice. But after hearing your story, I realized it's about control, not over others, but over myself." Elaine smiled and replied, "That's exactly right. The strongest officer is the calmest one." The young man nodded, eyes bright with understanding. Back at home, her life slowly returned to normal rhythms. She spent evenings reading or cooking simple meals. Sometimes she'd take long walks just to clear her head, but even in those quiet moments, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding, that what happened to her was now shaping the very fabric of how law enforcement operated in the country. The officer who had been convicted had already begun serving his sentence. Elaine never visited him, though she thought about it a few times. She didn't hate him. She didn't even resent him. In her heart, she believed that everyone deserved the chance to learn from their mistakes. And perhaps, someday he would too. Months later, a journalist requested an interview with her for a documentary on justice reform. At first, she declined. But after thinking about it, she agreed, as long as it wasn't framed as a personal story of suffering, but as a story of learning. During the interview, the journalist asked, "Do you think justice was done?" Elaine thought carefully before answering. "Justice isn't a single moment," she said softly. "It's a process." The courtroom part was one chapter. What comes after, the changes, the awareness, the better training, that's the real justice. That's what matters. The interviewer nodded, visibly moved. When the documentary aired weeks later, it struck a chord across the country. Viewers praised her composure and authenticity. Parents wrote about watching it with their kids. Officers wrote about discussing it during training sessions. It became more than a story. It became a mirror for society to look into. Meanwhile, the reforms under Project Clarity expanded. The FBI and local police departments started joint workshops in multiple cities. Community leaders were invited to observe and share feedback. It was messy, imperfect, and slow, but it was progress. One afternoon, as Elaine walked through one of these workshops, she saw a local officer helping a new recruit learn proper identification procedures. The older officer pointed to a screen showing fake versus real credentials, saying, You always double-check, you never assume. Elaine smiled quietly. Those simple words, never assume, summed up everything she wanted to change. Later that evening, she attended a private dinner with senior officials. The conversation turned to her experience again. Someone asked, "If you could go back to that night, would you change anything?" She paused, then shook her head slowly. "No," she said. As painful as it was, it brought light to something that needed to be seen. Sometimes the hardest moments in life open doors to understanding that peace never could. They all sat quietly for a while after that, letting her words hang in the air. By the end of that year, national crime reports began to note a subtle but steady improvement in officer conduct statistics. Incidents of mistaken identity and procedural violations had gone down. It wasn't a miracle, just proof that people were trying. Elaine didn't claim credit. She didn't want it. What mattered to her was knowing that her story had sparked a shift in how officers thought, how leaders led, and how the system cared. One night, she received a call from a small police academy in a southern state. The instructor told her they had added her story to their ethics course. "It reminds our recruits that every decision matters," he said. "Every second of judgment can define who they are as officers." Elaine smiled softly. That's all I ever wanted. As months passed, she began writing her experiences in a small notebook, not for publication, not for history, but for herself. She wrote about fear, patience, justice, and compassion. Some nights she'd read over a page or two, remembering how it all began. One flashing light on a quiet road. One misunderstanding that changed the course of so many lives. In the end, she realized something she hadn't before. What defines strength isn't power, but grace. Grace to forgive, grace to rebuild, and grace to keep believing in goodness even after seeing its opposite. That night, as rain tapped softly against her window, she closed her notebook and whispered, "It's not over yet. Change never is." Then she turned off the light and let the sound of the rain fill the silence, a soft, steady rhythm that somehow felt like hope itself.